Hello, everyone. My name is Brooke Sutherland. I write about the manufacturing industry for Bloomberg Opinion, and I am joined today by Mike Lamach of Trane Technologies. I'm really happy he's taking this time to talk with us. I wrote a profile piece on Mike earlier this week that sort of traced his evolution as the CEO of this company, and we're going to talk a little bit about what exactly that was like and also some things that the company is doing right now. As you can imagine, we are in a pandemic with an airborne contagion, so HVAC is top of mind. And so I wanted to start first, Mike, with just sort of asking you, as we move indoors, as temperatures get colder, what should we be aware of? I mean, what sort of tools can individuals and companies use to make sure that they're operating in a safe way?
Hey, Brooke, great to be with you, and thanks for having me. Yeah, that is the big question. And I was on our earnings call today, I was mentioning this 1.7 trillion square feet of indoor space around the world.
Wow.
And 400 billion square feet of communal, non-residential space. So we're all worried about thinking about this stuff like we never did before. There's a day one approach, which is to try to mitigate what you can so things can safely or as safely as possible reopen. There's a longer term approach to how you might need to revitalize buildings or assets to perform even better. So the way we look at it is a holistic approach. We try to avoid things that are just sort of spot solutions, just filtration or other devices. The best thing you can do initially is outdoor air exchanges. The more outdoor air you can put in a space is your first line of defense. And buildings are designed to have a certain number of outdoor air exchanges. They're different by building. Restaurants in New York City, where you are, might be 8 to 12 air changes per hour. We want to make sure they're actually achieving that. Then we'll look at filtration and humidity and pressure as other areas that we can, and then potentially devices that could kill or trap contaminants as well. But through that, we can really do wonders around trying to improve indoor air quality. The flip side of that is if you don't do anything, if you don't have any outdoor exchange or have a poor system, my fear is it could contribute to bad contaminants in space. And so it's something to really pay attention to.
So on that topic, if you don't do anything, I do wonder, because we are in an economic downturn as well, and the money is tight for a lot of businesses. So are you seeing companies willing to invest in this, or is this something that they're sort of having to push off for down the road?
Yeah, it's really, I can think about it as a bell curve. And on one end of it, sadly, are the businesses that are not going to reopen or already have closed or in some sort of economic jeopardy and really they're not open. You've got the other end, which is going to be healthcare and pharmaceutical and the folks that absolutely need to be best in class at this, and they are going full speed ahead. And you've got the bulk of the market, probably 60% of the market in the middle, where either they're opening or planning to reopen, and that's where those mitigating actions are taking place right now. There's literally nobody that we're talking to that's not asking the questions as to, what can we do? How can we mitigate? And for us, our customers would measure in the tens of billions of square feet of space. So it's really an industry-wide solution to get to all the space in the world. And it's not just our company, but the HVAC industry at large really coming together to provide those sorts of assessments and those mitigating solutions.
And then you talked about the importance of outdoor air, and I know that sustainability is also very important for your company. And when you allow that outdoor in to come inside, your system sort of has to work harder to keep the space at the proper temperature. So how do you think about improving indoor air quality, but then also making sure that you're not backsliding on some of these emissions goals or sustainability initiatives?
Yeah, it's exactly right, Brooke. Temperature and humidity are important, and it's almost luck of the draw if you should bring in outdoor air precisely where you need it. So you're always having to condition that air somehow. We see that between bringing in outdoor air at a higher level and filtration, which a lot of people are jumping to very, very dense filters, which causes a lot of horsepower and fan and air to be moved across that filter, which may affect actually negatively the space at the end of the run of the ductwork or the building itself. And so you have to think about these things again holistically. But you can think about a lot of the indoor air quality measures taking 15 to 40% more energy to make them happen. So at the same time we're doing that, we're looking for those energy conservation measures to mitigate that back down, better control sequences, tighter occupancy control, better scheduling as an example to be able to do that, or other conservation measures that could take place. And there are those to be had. But the first thing people need to do is make the space safe, and then simultaneously working on the back end of that as well to help them regain that economic control of their budgets. But again, first is keep people safe.
Certainly. So against all of this backdrop, you did actually report some earnings today, and they were quite good. And within that, you actually improved your revenue guidance for the year. What's the biggest driver of that? I mean, is that people making sort of these investments in indoor air quality? Is it more on the residential side?
Yeah, for Q3, we thought that revenues would be down, say, 10 to 15%. They were actually up. They were positive almost a point. And there were a couple of drivers there. One was on the residential business, which for us is really a North American, US, and Canada business. Surprisingly, people were not repairing, they're replacing. They're replacing with better systems, and they're putting in better systems to filter and catch contaminants. So to the extent that the consumer still feels good, feels optimistic about their job, we're seeing good trends there. I don't think it continues at this rate. We've never seen this before at this rate. I think it normalizes in Q4 and in 2021, but that was a big driver. The second was some of the work we're doing, particularly with new products, and I'll go back to a conversation we had some time ago in Europe, where we're replacing fossil-fired boilers in buildings with devices that are 4 times more energy efficient. We're seeing great growth there. And Europe is mainly a heating market rather than a cooling market. So the electrification of heat and moving away from fossil-fueled heating is driving a lot of growth for us in Europe. And then indoor air quality, where we're seeing assessments and those day one mitigating solutions we put in place. And so we're starting to see the service business, which grew faster than the equipment business. So on one hand, all buildings aren't open, therefore we can't provide service. But on the other hand, the people that are opening or want to open are doing more IAQ work to get open and be safe. And so that's providing a bit of a tailwind right now.
On the topic of businesses that aren't open yet, I mean, there's a lot of debate, a lot of discussion about how much office space we really need in the future. I am in my office right now, but there are not many people here with me. I mean, as you think about sort of the longer term, are we moving toward an environment where there's ultimately less office space? And what does that mean for your business? How do you adapt to that?
Yeah, Brooke, and I'm actually in my office here too, which is not the norm. We're about 10% occupied, but with earnings, I'm here today and here a couple times a week. We did 2 things. One is we surveyed our own people, and then we surveyed did primary research with a broad range of global customers, and we're finding a couple, archetypes here. Here, we're seeing people that are absolutely going to be working differently remotely, and people on the other extreme that are absolutely thinking a vaccine is going to, produce a back to normal situation. I think the truth is going to be somewhere in the middle for most of us. For our people, for our own company, we're seeing that we are fairly productive, and that everything doesn't need to be performed here in the office, and that for a lot of our workforce, there's some flexibility that would actually help the whole work-life balance, which is a really big part of our whole culture and the reason I think we've been successful around attracting and retaining people over time into our company. We're seeing that in the primary research we did, and we had about 800 customers in this research, is that there's 2 theories. One is you could see a 30% reduction in the space that people require and potentially reduction of services like our own. It's probably not going to happen. What will happen is that we'll see that space absorbed by fewer people and the need to occupy the same space with more distancing happening in those spaces. And fundamentally the same cooling loads and demand for power to run those buildings and systems. We think that's going to be generally the norm. But over time, depending on sort of how people feel about the vaccine or at least therapeutics, we could see occupancy start sneaking closer maybe to 80, 90% in the next 18 months to 2 years. So this is really about holding the course and direction of a vaccine and a recovery. We're finding that certain things we do just aren't as good when they're done virtually. So think about the culture of a company and how do you indoctrinate people into your business? How do you have strategic discussions and innovation reviews? And how do you do, some of the brainstorming that happens? Well, it's tougher to do virtually. but a lot of our day can be spent without traveling as much. And so I think business travel drops over time, and we're seeing probably the use of more standard work being some of the social meeting platforms that we use going forward.
But offices aren't going away. And I guess even if you have 10 people in it, you still need an HVAC system. So we're not all.
If you have 8 people, you're probably just going to spread them out further. Yes.
That makes sense. I know you guys also sell a lot of equipment into warehouses. Obviously, e-commerce has been a big bright spot in this economy. Are you seeing a lot of demand there, sort of investments in additional capacity?
Yes, that's been big. And we actually were fortunate because about 10 years ago, we began to emphasize e-commerce, and we knew that warehousing would be a big deal. As you try to attract people to work in e-commerce, you really have to air condition the buildings. It's not a matter anymore of being able to just attract all these people in to go work in a warehouse if you don't have the conditions for people to work in. So we're seeing air-conditioned warehousing at this point in time. And that's been one of the fastest growing markets for us, along with data centers. And as everything moves to the cloud and people are working from home more, of course, that's been a strong demand driver as well. So those 2 vertical markets in particular really are growing for us. We had emphasized that about 10 years ago and de-emphasized a lot of the big box retail work because we just didn't see how those were, in the long run, that wasn't going to be a head-on collision. And in some ways, we're seeing that through this pandemic probably accelerating.
That turned out to be a pretty good bet, I think, just given some of the results that we're seeing from those 4 retailers. Speaking of good bets, a lot of what I wrote about in my profile was when you first became CEO and some of the decisions that you made to invest in the Trane business. And those are really paying off today in terms of a lot of the things that we're talking about. And I wondered if you could sort of walk through that at a high level for some of the viewers right now, and the decisions that you made and why you thought it was so important to prioritize investments in sustainability.
Yeah, the big picture is that when you think about global greenhouse gas emissions, today 15% of all global emissions happen from HVAC systems. It's not the power to run them, it's actually the refrigerants and the systems themselves. And that grows to 25%, pretty much doing what it is the world is doing right now, codes and standards. Just because the world's getting hotter, people are urbanizing to a greater extent and or becoming, in developing markets, more of a standard to have air conditioning. So we knew it was going to grow to 25%. We also know that food waste and losses in the cold chain equate to another 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. So for us, 35% of global greenhouse gas emissions happen to be 100% of the businesses that we're in. And we felt like if we were on the right side of trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, lower energy intensity in buildings and in processes, we're going to do good for the world, and we've got to grow faster than the economy because you have to do something about fixing these problems. And so we landed on some technologies that could reduce 99.9% of the greenhouse gas emissions from commercial HVAC systems. We launched those in 2013, and the market really began to take notice in 2016. And the growth rates that we've experienced have been tremendous because we launched those while eliminating the refrigerant that caused the damage, and doing that in a way where those systems were actually more energy efficient than the predecessors that used the wrong refrigerants. And that dynamic of not having people choose between being green or saving money, they weren't making a choice anymore. They were actually able to get and do both. And it created an innovation advantage for us that we've been continuing to press and expand that portfolio and think of new ideas, like the example of electrifying heat in Europe and not using fossil fuel boilers. We weren't even in the heating business, but we got in the heating business through just the application of innovation against this greenhouse gas problem. But more than that, when it comes to things about social injustice, when it comes to gender parity, you're going to find us on the side of the equation of diversity and inclusion too. And by just setting our compass there, it doesn't matter kind of what administrations do or what happens around the globe. It gives us really a true north direction and a sense of stability about where we're going to weigh in on issues, whether it's the environment or what's happening in the world today. We know where we stand, and it's helpful, I think, for all of us in our company to know that and where we're going to, put our thumb.
And one of the reasons why I really wanted to write about Trane is because I do think, the financial and the environmental goals are very intersected at your company, which I think is somewhat unique. But obviously, sustainability, diversity, and inclusion, these are big topics right now. I mean, what advice would you give to other CEOs who want to be more sustainable, who want to make more of a difference in terms of their culture?
Well, first, you have to personally mean what you say, because you can't fake this. For our younger people in the company, particularly people under 35 years of age, they believe purpose is more important than profits. I believe that profits follow purpose, and if you do the right things, you'll find a way to earn a lot of money doing this. And by the way, over an 11-year period, if you had bought our stock 11 years ago and you held Allegiant and you held Ingersoll Rand and you hold Trane Technology, you'd be up 1,900%. So it's not as if it's not been a good investment over time by holding all those pieces.
That's pretty good. I think so many people would take that.
Yeah, the other thing I would tell you is don't set the goals from the top. The thing that we did was we used town halls and jam sessions and social forums to really engage a lot of people in this conversation. What are people passionate about? And what do we do as a company that's actually meaningful and important? So you can't pick something that's not tied to your strategy. And so when we landed on the greenhouse gas emission goals, being net carbon neutral in our own company by 2030, around gender parity, around our workforce looking like the communities that we live in from just a racial perspective going forward, ethnic perspective going forward, we really landed on a set of things that everybody really embraced. And it drove higher engagement, it drove higher retention, which ultimately drove profitability and the ability to innovate and build great customer relationships over time, because we're not turning people over. And that's been a formula that if you stick with it long enough, it seems to work.
On the topic of people turning over, you had a very interesting approach to what played out with the pandemic, and obviously your business has been somewhat of a beneficiary from some of the trends that we're seeing, but you haven't had to make major layoffs, and in fact, you actually sent workers home while you invested in PPE. And I wondered if you could just talk about why you made that decision and sort of what the ramifications have been in your business from taking that hit financially at the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, first, safety has been, when we do an employee engagement survey, we sort of rank off the charts around how people think about engagement, around safety, around ethics. And so treating people with respect is at the core of what we do. And so you have to take something like this really safety very, very seriously. We're also the major employer in many markets where we operate. And if we infected, sort of a community, it would be devastating to that community. So we wanted to make sure that we had all the protocols in place, that we really envisioned how jobs would need to change inside the company, on the lines in our factories, all the way through to in our offices, get the PPE in place, make the changes, and then sort of relaunch. So we shut down for a couple of weeks with the exception of really critical things that we were supporting: healthcare, pharma, nursing homes, where we had to be part of the solution. But by that, shutting those factories down, those operations down, and redoing these things, we're able to restart without ever having to shut down again and be able to operate through this, keeping people safe in that process. So it worked out as being a good decision. But, again, shutting down for a couple of weeks in the busiest week of the busiest quarter, was hard. Economically hard for us, and we paid the price for that in the first quarter when earnings missed consensus expectations. But frankly, it's, again, you have to put people ahead of profits, and it worked out.
We're now about 7 months into this pandemic, although it seems like a lot longer at times. I mean, there's obviously still a ways to go, but as you take a step back, I mean, what's the biggest lesson that you've learned so far from this moment in time? Anything you would do differently going forward?
Well, there's so many things that we've learned and we would do different. One is just how we do work today. I think that there's no doubt we can think about how we work tomorrow differently, and whether that's more flexibility depending on what you do and how you do it, or at least the work-life balance, the amount of travel that people need to do in their jobs can change. And I think it benefits our people, it benefits shareholders. Certainly work-life balance improves on that. We're going to learn from that. We always thought about a playbook in a recession. We never really had a playbook for a pandemic-caused recession. And so just like we've developed playbooks for hurricanes and what do we do in advance for a hurricane, how do we support our people after a hurricane, how do we get back into production after a hurricane, this notion of how do we support our people during pandemics would be a standard part of a playbook that we would have going forward. That's a pretty big learning for us as well, too. I think we're all going to be more prepared about how we operate, through these challenges. And we can't expect that this is going to be the last pandemic that we see. I mean, we would all be, I think, remiss if we thought that.
You are also the chair of the National Association of Manufacturers, so you have sort of a dual perspective here, because one other response to the pandemic that we've heard a lot about is this sort of reshoring of supply chains, reshoring of factories. Are you looking at doing anything like that internally, first of all? And then second of all, how much of a trend do you actually see this being?
Yeah, interestingly, sometimes the leaner the company, meaning the less inventory on hand that you had, put you in a more precarious position, during the pandemic. And so our people did a great job of really daily, almost hourly, making sure that we were working with our suppliers and our supply chain to stay in production and to keep things moving. With that being said, I am hearing more about people getting in, and I will say that we are looking at tier 3 and tier 4 suppliers to, tier 1, tier 2 suppliers in our organization today, and rethinking some of those supply chains, making sure that we've got either duplication of the supply chain or alternate sources of supply, alternate locations for supply. So we watched, China sort of go down first, and that impacted supply chains in the U.S. We watched that go through Europe, and to a certain extent, it hurt supply here. Mexico was an enormous challenge for U.S. manufacturers because that supply chain was so, intermingled with U.S. production that was also a bigger challenge than the markets actually maybe thought that to be. So frankly, you put that all together, you needed to have suppliers in all parts of the world, and you needed to have probably alternate suppliers or alternate strategies for supply. And that is something we're all looking more closely at going forward.
Understood. We are also coming up on an election. I don't know if you've heard, but Vice President Joe Biden is proposing, a pretty aggressive climate plan, and part of that is calling for greater efficiency in buildings and residences. If that does actually come to pass, that is put into action, what are sort of the ramifications for your business?
Yeah, the good news is when you take the name off, any current candidate or future candidate and say, does the policies reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Does it reduce energy intensity of the world? Does it help feed people? Does it help move medicine and vaccine to people that need them when they need it? Does it invite diversity and inclusion? If it does those things, it makes it really easy for us to understand sort of how those policies would be beneficial for us, because that's where we're going to line up on those things. From what we know about the plan that the vice president is proposing around his plan, clearly energy efficiency in buildings would be right up our alley. I will say, though, where the administration today sort of backed off maybe some of that in terms of the Kigali Agreement, Paris Accord, you've seen states and municipalities sort of step in. So I don't feel like, we've worked probably harder to aggregate a lot of that sort of state and local involvement, but you have to hand it to governors and mayors of cities and companies, frankly, that kept pushing straight ahead and kept charging, knowing at the end of the day it's the right thing to do.
Understood. All right, great. Well, this has been really helpful and really insightful. I appreciate you taking the time. Are there any final thoughts or anything that you'd like to add?
No, just Brooke, be safe, and all the people listening, be well, be safe, and hope to see you soon.
You as well. Thanks so much. Have
Thank
a good
you.
day. Bye.
Bye.